Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Center for Emerging Democracies, and very excited to have Rebecca Hanson here today from the University of Florida for her book talk on her new book, Policing the Revolution. But before I introduce Rebecca and her respondent, I just want to give a couple background stories that I couldn't resist giving about Rebecca, who I know back from when she was a master's student at the University of Chicago, where I was a professor. And she was in my class on authoritarian regimes. And there are two stories that I remember very vividly about Rebecca in my class. Yeah. First, anyone here as a professor knows about sometimes in class, there's someone this was a big class. There's probably 25 people, almost all PhD students. And Rebecca wasn't the most vocal person in the class. So one day after class, she comes up to me and she says, "You from the South by any chance?" And I said, "Why do you say that?" She said, "Because this is the way you say against. You don't say against, you say against." So ever since then, I said, "Well, I went to Emory, so I've spent a lot of time in the South." So okay. So ever since then, every time I say the word against, I think of Rebecca. Against. So it's always a little hesitation. But the real impression that Rebecca left in that class was in the final paper she wrote. And this is one of these things where, sometimes you remember where you were when you read something because it was so good. And I was in a cafe on Harvard Square in Cambridge and reading Rebecca's final response paper to the class, and she tore the class to shreds and basically said, "There is no society in here. What have you done? This is a class about authoritarian elites with no attention to the social side of things." And it was just sort of a whole reimagination of what the class could have been. And I was like, this is phenomenal. It was so good. I was like, this person is truly going somewhere. So I knew from then on, this is going to be a real star scholar. And she's totally proven that to be true. So when she reached out recently and said she had her first book coming out, her first individual book coming out, and asked if she could give a book talk, I was totally delighted to be able to welcome her to Michigan. So that's my informal introduction. We're going to be a little more formal now. So Rebecca Hanson is an assistant professor at the University of Florida with a joint appointment in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law and the Center for Latin American Studies. She is also the founder and director of University of Florida's International Ethnography Lab. This academic year, she's a visiting fellow at Harvard's David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies and Notre Dame's Kellogg Institute for International Studies. Besides her new book, Policing the Revolution, which we'll be hearing about today, Rebecca has already co-authored and co-edited two additional books, Harassed, Gender, Bodies, and Ethnographic Research, which was co-authored with Patricia Richards and published with the University of California Press in 2019. And along with David Smilda and Veronica Zubidaga, she is also co-editor of The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, Revolution, Crime, and Policing During Chavismo, and that's from the University of Pittsburgh Press 2022. Her respondent today will be Luciana Chamorro. Luciana is assistant professor of anthropology here at the University of Michigan. She is a sociocultural anthropologist of the Central American region as diasporas. She was a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for Emerging Democracies from 2021 to 2023. And she's currently writing a book entitled Afterlives of Revolution, Political Attachments in Post-Revolutionary Nicaragua, which examines the effects of economies that underpin what appear to be paradoxical forms of popular investment and the authoritarian political project of Daniel Ortega in contemporary Nicaragua. So thank you again for coming. Delighted to have Rebecca here to talk about her new book.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Let me get my notes pulled up. Okay, well, I will start by saying thank you so much for bringing me to Michigan. I really appreciate it. I will respond to your memories of me in your class by saying that despite my paper tearing the class apart, maybe I felt very much out of place in my master's program, and your class was one of the ones that was like, okay, I think I want to do this. I definitely think I want to do this. So thank you so much. Thank you for all the support from the Center for Emerging Democracies to bring me here. This is my first time presenting on the book since it's actually been out. So it's very, very exciting to be like, oh yeah, this is actually done. So I'm going to start off the talk by doing like the very cliche qualitative thing, which is to read a little bit of a vignette. It's the vignette that I actually start the book off with. But I promise I'm not going to read it you the entire time. I think it just does a good job of kind of like setting up kind of like the hook of the book, I suppose. So in the first chapter, I describe an interview that I conducted with a team of researchers with a woman, Violeta, and her family in the state of Miranda in Venezuela in 2018. When we arrived at her house, she and her family took us through a narrow hallway to the back out to like an outdoor patio. When we reached the patio, we formed a circle around a splatter of dark stains. Her stepfather placed a few rusted chairs and plastic beer cases on the patio for us to sit, as she detailed how the police had broken into her home and thrown her out before killing her husband, Jason. She started by narrating how the day began. So my son woke up and says, "Papa, make me an empanada before I go to kindergarten." So Jason makes empanadas for the two kids, my daughter who's going to school and my son to preschool. I tell him to make me two arepas, which are kind of like corn cakes that you eat in Venezuela, because empanadas don't fill me up. And I sit down to sew. So as I sit, veo el gobierno. So this literally means I see the government, but it's a phrase that's oftentimes used to refer to the police. So here she's literally saying, like, I see the police coming. So I see the police coming. So I go to lock our metal door and I tell Jason, grab our son. They're coming to kill you. They're coming to kill you, because I knew that's what they were there to do. This was about 8 a.m. So they're breaking the door down, and I say to them, don't break the door down, I'll open it. Jason had grabbed our son, so I thought to myself, they won't do anything to him. He's holding our son. They come in, and I cling to the father of my children, holding our son. Then they're yelling at me, let him go, bitch, let him go, bitch. He knew this was coming. And I ask them, why are you going to kill him if he's not involved in anything? And he says, I'm not involved in anything. I'm just trying to raise my kids. I don't give a shit what you say, bastard, says the police officer, all the time yelling for me to let him go. They take me out of the house, and when I tried to get back in, an officer slapped me hard across the face. So while she waited outside with her neighbors, the police proceeded to haul items out of people's homes into their trucks. Blenders, telephones, furniture, even the tires off of a bus that Violeta's father had recently sold to a friend. At some point, multiple shots were fired from the back of the house. That's when they took his body out of the house, she said. When they took him, he was dead, completely dead. They grabbed him. There were 4 of them. Each one grabbed a foot or arm, and they threw him into their truck. As she told the story, she pointed to bullet holes left by the officers, evidence that Jason had resisted arrest, and places where she and her family had worked to clean blood out of the concrete. I was surprised by the steadiness of her voice as she recounted perhaps the most painful moment of her life, a steadiness that had developed, I suspected, with the retelling of a story many times over. So apart from discussions with friends and family members, she had also gone to the police and prosecutor's office, first trying to find the body of her husband, and then figure out what had happened, like why it had happened. Her stepfather had also gone to the police, kind of trying to file a report about the tires off of the bus that was taken. And so when her stepfather went to the police, he was told by a police officer, keep voting for your government. There's much more in store. So Violeta was one of the victims of state violence that I and a team of researchers interviewed in 2018 as we were documenting instances of human rights violations that took place under the government of Nicolás Maduro between 2015 and 2017. So these took place largely, I have 2 things here. Largely under 2 security initiatives. One, the Operación de Liberación del Pueblo, which is the Operation Liberation of the People. And the second, Las Fuerzas de Acciones Especiales, which are kind of like special tactical units. So the OLP was implemented in 2015, the FICE in 2017. So during these raids, dozens of military and police officers would swarm into the barrios, which in Venezuela refers to just poor and working class sectors. They would swarm into the barrios and engage in mass arrests and sometimes in mass killings. So images like these flooded social media, really positioning the police as instruments of death. And these initiatives contributed to an incredible rise in state violence at the time. So in 2016, Luisa Ortega, who was then Venezuela's kind of attorney general, announced that the police in Venezuela were responsible for 21% of all violent deaths that took place in the country. And by 2018, this number had risen to 33%. As you can see on the chart, kind of, I know the numbers are a little bit small, but between 2016 and 2019, the police in Venezuela killed around 5,000 people each year, which made them the most lethal police forces in the entire region, beating out Brazil, which tends to usually be the country that has the most violent police forces. So this violence took place during a time period in Venezuela that's known as the Bolivarian Revolution, which is a term that Hugo Chavez, who was the president of the country from 1999 until 2013, and his followers referred to kind of the political project that he was implementing, really calling the Bolivarian Revolution, really kind of conjuring up the idea of Simón Bolívar, who's of course the man who is credited with fighting for independence in much of South America from Spain. So under Nicolas Maduro, who is Chavez's successor, the country has become increasingly authoritarian, has been compared to Soviet Russia, as well as Cold War right-wing military dictatorships in the region. So in some ways, Violetta's story that I just read very much so conjures up these same ideas and these same images, right, of like Castro's Cuba or Stalin's Russia, because you have police who are engaging in robbery, murder with complete impunity, with absolutely no accountability or punishment. And the police in Venezuela for a long time have oftentimes been characterized in this way as like directly authoritarian, coming in the same path as Cuba or other authoritarian countries. So in this context, police officers are plundering and killing with complete impunity. When victims dare to seek answers, they're reminded where their support should lie come election time. The problem is that when Violetta was telling us this story first, her husband was not a political dissident. He'd recently been released from prison for a very petty crime, and was adamant about staying off of the police's radar before they killed him. Secondly, as Violetta repeated the officer's words to us, her tone was sarcastic, as if she was telling a sadistic joke. The officer's implicit threat that more terror was in store for them was not intended to scare up support for the government. Instead, the officer wasn't performing solidarity, but instead mocking the association between poor families like Violetta and the government that historically poor families have supported electorally. So he's not identifying himself with the Chavista political project, but instead boasting about the terror that he could invoke in the name of Chavismo, right? So drawing on ethnographic interview, focus group, and survey data that I collected over the course of 10 years between 2012 and 2022, in this book, I try to situate the violence that Violetta and thousands of other poor and working class Venezuelans experienced at the same time that the security landscape was being completely and totally transformed by the Bolivarian Revolution. So as I conducted my dissertation research between 2012 and 2014, which is what provided the first few years of data for this book, as we do when we're starting new research projects, I started reading about policing in other socialist contexts. And in a lot of this work, the police are very much so highlighted as important as ideological actors or politically motivated, right, who are acting on behalf of the state to protect its interests. But as I was reading this work and conducting my research, I just didn't see really any kind of conversation between what I was seeing on the ground and these previous characterizations of what policing looks like in 20th century socialist projects. So, for example, when I first started my research, I thought that my dissertation was going to be about a police reform that was implemented by Hugo Chavez starting in about 2008. It was a really interesting police reform that was led by human rights activists that had been engaged in human rights activism for 10, 20, 30 years in Venezuela against police violence. So basically, he was hiring people who've been fighting police violence for years to come up with a new model of policing in the country. This reform died with him in 2013, but I was very interested in it to begin with. And the background of the human rights activists who were leading this police reform was even kind of built into the infrastructure, the aesthetics of the institutions they created. So these are some pictures that I took inside the police university that was created by reformers. And there are murals that are dedicated to victims of police violence in the country. So like within the police academy, you have paintings that are recognizing the incredibly violent and repressive history of policing in Venezuela. The quote on the right, I won't read to you, but is from a mother whose son was killed by the police in 1992 and became a very vocal advocate against police violence in the country. And so this was very much so like kind of being a shrine to previous victims of police violence in the country. But as I continued doing research for this book over the course of the next 8 years, policing returned to its militarized roots, which is where you can see the pictures that I showed earlier of the very scary masks that police officers had on. And it was during that time period that I interviewed Violetta and other victims of state violence. So what I argue in the book is that her story, unfortunately, exemplifies a very tragic contradiction of the Bolivarian Revolution, that a government that promised to improve the lives of the poor and did so in myriad ways for a number of years also killed them and imprisoned them on an unprecedented scale, nothing that had ever been before seen in the country previously. So despite opening my book this way and my talk this way, this book is not actually about like violence workers, which is Martha Huggins' term for police officers in Brazil during the military dictatorship. It's not about like overly powered or invincible police forces in Venezuela. It's about how the police and residents of poor and working class sectors understand and try to navigate a constantly shifting landscape in the context of a government that's still kind of trying to work out what its actual vision for the country is, and what does that mean to be a police officer in that context. It's also about how revolutionary projects and politics can actually fray the relationships between a government and its own police forces. So in the book, I put forward 3 questions. 1, how did a revolutionary state project transform coercive power and the institutions and actors that we traditionally assume wield coercion in defense of the state? 2, how did these changes affect those the revolution promised to champion and protect? And 3, what can this case tell us? More about policing, left-wing governance, and state power in the contemporary global South. And so I put forward or try to group my arguments into kind of 3 main arguments. 1, we know quite a bit now about the right's approach to crime and policing and prisons in Latin America. So they've been very much so associated with heavy-handed or punitive approaches to policing, right? The right has also been very much so linked to neoliberal policies, which has produced what scholars of violence in Latin America refer to as a pluralization of violent actors. So we have a general kind of idea of the way that how the right has transformed policing in the region. We have a lot of scholarship on the left in Latin America. A lot of this comes from the time period referred to as like the pink tide, the left turn, which happened in the early 2000s. But really none of this scholarship looks at policing or crime during this period, which is a glaring absence because crime and violence skyrocketed incredibly during this time period. So I see this as one of the book's main contributions, is really thinking about how does the left approach problems of crime and policing and security. And so what I argue is that leftist governance in Venezuela produced outcomes most often associated with the right and neoliberalism, but through different mechanisms. So this includes things like the pluralization of armed actors, the outsourcing and individualization of security, and the dispersal of coercive power. 2, I think this happens with a lot of authoritarian governments. And just a quick note, I categorize Hugo Chávez's government as like a hybrid democracy and think about authoritarianism really beginning under Nicolás Maduro. But the Chavista project in general has really been described and understood as kind of like always authoritarian, so authoritarian from the very beginning, and kind of just becoming increasingly so over a relatively like linear time period. And I think this really overlooks this concept that David Smiley, Veronica Zubillaga, and I use to think about Chavismo, which is revolutionary governance. So this concept really tries to highlight the conflicts that have taken place in Venezuela as the government tried to implement a revolutionary project. And of course, we're paying attention to conflict between the political opposition and Chavismo. But what we're more interested in, because it's been much less studied, is conflict within the state itself. So what's going on within Chavismo and what struggles are happening within Chavismo over orderance, power, vision for the future of the country. So what I argue in the book is that the Bolivarian Revolution was defined by highly contested and contrasting visions that resulted in state fragmentation and chaotic and inconsistent security policies. And finally, in dialogue with the work that I mentioned earlier, in terms of thinking about policing in socialist contexts, rather than thinking about understanding police actions and violence as the result of state directives or state interests, I argue that police violence must be decoupled from state interest in certain moments. In these moments, police violence is better explained as an attempt to resist the state and its political project. So just a side note here in questioning this like universal alignment between like state interests and police actions. I'm not saying that police actions in the final instance do not serve state interests, right? So where police officers see their actions as righting the state's wrongs or resisting its interests, the end result can still benefit state actors. So in short, police violence can still be politically useful, even when the police are not politicized. I'm also not denying that political repression has taken place in Venezuela by the police, but I think the focus on this really overlooks most of what's going on in Venezuela in relation to the police, because most of the people who have been victimized by the police in Venezuela are not the political opposition. They're people in poor and working class sectors, again, have historically supported Chavismo. So with a little bit of time I have left, I think I have about 15 minutes maybe. I'm trying to keep up with it. I want to try to just make this a little bit more concrete, some of the arguments that I've been putting forward. So I'm going to focus in on a case that I look at in two chapters. So in chapters 4 and 8, I look at the relationships that develop between some state actors and groups now known as colectivos in Venezuela. So the colectivos start, and I'll go into a little bit more in depth in a minute on them, but they started out as leftist armed community organizations that have eventually kind of evolved into parastate organizations. So I look at the relationships between them and state actors. And then in chapter 8, I also look at these volatile and fragile relationships that the government has constructed with gangs that has resulted in the consolidation of criminal governance. And so I refer to these relationships as producing what I call a dispersal of coercive power and outsourcing of security. So the colectivos grow out of a leftist insurgency movement. Venezuela is different from other countries in Latin America in that it didn't have this like massive leftist insurgency that a lot of other countries have dealt with. But there was some degree of leftist organizing and violent response to the state in the 1960s. And the colectivos kind of come out of that history and are born in the 1970s and the 1980s. But they're very much so community-based organizations. And they really see themselves as defending their communities from two different types of threats. One, police violence and drug trafficking. So again, very community-based. I guess I'm on my email there. As I mentioned, these relationships evolve and look very different between 2002 to the present. But they start because, for people who might be somewhat familiar with Venezuelan history, Hugo Chavez was removed from office for 48 hours in 2002. This happened during a coup d'etat that was organized by the political opposition, business leaders, the military, and the Metropolitan Police, which is important. The Metropolitan Police was the largest police force in the country at the time, was also charged with policing Caracas. So the police participate in this coup. It fails. Hugo Chavez comes back into office. And when he comes back, the government is now faced with this issue of who guards the guardians. You know, if we can't count on the police during a coup, during a threat, during moments of crisis, then who can we turn to? And if the police turn against us, who can we turn to? And the way that some members of Chavismo, some factions within Chavismo deal with this issue is by starting to construct relationships with these armed community organizations precisely because they already have a leftist ideology that links them to the Chavez government. So while Chavez was in power, these relationships remained relatively inconsistent and somewhat fragile and contradictory. But more importantly, within the kind of like Venezuelan imaginary, it was very much so understood that the government and the colectivos were tightly intertwined. That's really the perception that people had of these relationships. And that can be seen in some of the graffiti that I have up here. On this side, it's actually a picture taken by Richard Snyder while he was in Caracas of, you can't really see the size of the water tower, but it's a huge water tower that's in Western Caracas, which is where the colectivos initially started. So you have this huge water tower that's kind of looking over Western Caracas. On one side, you have the face of Hugo Chavez, the president. And on the other side, Lino Ron, who was one of the leaders of La Piedrita, which is one of the country's largest and oldest colectivos. So basically, you have them side by side, like watching over and supervising Caracas. On the other side is some stencil graffiti that I took a picture of. And you can see this all across Western Caracas that basically declares Chavez as a Tupamaro. So the Tupamaros are another colectivo. And what this graffiti is basically saying is like, Chavez is one of us. He's one of ours. And this perception that there's a very strong and tightly intertwined relationship between these groups has really important implications for how the police understand their own power and how they understand their place within the state, right? So all throughout my time conducting field work, police officers voiced different frustrations, concerns, anger, feelings of insecurity about these relationships that government actors were constructing with the colectivos. So I kind of tried to group these under, what were some of the questions that were coming up for police officers during this time period. One that came up a whole lot was basically who actually has the power to order space and bodies within this territory. So one example of this is one day I was watching a game of bolas criollas, which is kind of like bocce ball in Venezuela, with Edmund, a police officer, and his uncle. As we're watching the game, his uncle, who worked in an area of town that colectivo members operated in, he worked in a pharmacy, starts telling a story about colectivo members that were leading a police officer out of their neighborhood. So it was a police officer that had been assigned to patrol that territory. The colectivo members had grabbed him and were leading him out. And much worse than that, supposedly were doing that with his own gun and had handcuffed him with his own handcuffs. And so it's hard to think of a more humiliating experience for a police officer to go through, right? Edmund actually responds to this story by saying, like, I would rather him kill me than be paraded out of a neighborhood that I'm supposed to be patrolling. It would be much less humiliating. And important, there are two important things about that story. One, it's an incredibly humiliating experience for the police officer, but it's one that police officers hold the government responsible for, right? This kind of second theme that came up a lot in the ways that police officers and also residents of the barrios, so there's a lot of overlap between the way police officers and members of poor and working class sectors talked about the colectivos, was basically the question of who protects the revolution. So again, a lot of scholarship is really focused on the police playing this role, but the police officers themselves actually saw the colectivos as the groups that the government trusted in moments of crisis. And this was some perspective that was very much so perpetuated by colectivo members themselves. So Valentin Santana, who is one of the leaders of La Piedrita, the colectivo I mentioned before, told journalists in 2019, as long as North American imperialism exists, so will the struggle, and we cannot hide that. Imperialists are there, and their path leads to the violent overthrow of the Bolivarian Revolution. And as El Comandante Hugo Chavez said, this is a peaceful revolution, but it is armed. Imperialists will not find ladies and gentlemen here. They will find people ready to seize a weapon. Similarly, Alexis, a national police officer and professor at the police academy, told me in conversation with other people one day, the colectivos are groups organized by the state to counteract any kind of situation or threat that represents a threat to the state. Sorry. And finally, because police officers saw the colectivos as the ones who were actually protecting the revolution, they believed that the government had extended protections to the colectivos as well. Kind of the degree of impunity we associate with police in Latin America, they very much so saw the colectivos as having the same degree of impunity. So for example, Matias, a national police officer, one day told me just a few weeks ago, a national police officer was shot wearing a bulletproof vest. The bullets went right through, but the government doesn't care. The colectivos have better weapons than the little pistols that we have. They don't care. Similarly, Edmund, in the conversation where we were watching this game of Bolas Criollas, told me and his uncle, the police have absolutely no control over the colectivos. In fact, I know officers who were jailed for trying to arrest their members. So I don't present this data as reflective of reality. Police officers are incredibly hyperbolic when they talk about the type of power that colectivo members have. But I do think it's important because, one, it does actually speak to an actual shift in the way that coercive power is being distributed in the country. The colectivos did have the ability to engage in coercive actions in their territory. So even if Edmund's uncle's story was fictitious, it's still very much the product of actual changes happening on the ground. I think it also matters because it tells us something about kind of officers' mental cartography of the state and their place within that cartography. And finally, because this has implications in the real world. So by that, I mean the frustrations that the police have with the colectivos eventually result in actual confrontations between the two groups. So these are news headlines about this shootout that I'll talk about in just a minute, basically saying that there are 5 members of Colectivo that were killed. So there's a shootout that happens in downtown Caracas in 2014 in October, because the CCPC, which is Venezuela's investigative police, enter a building that the colectivos had taken over a long time before. So they enter the building, go in, there's a shootout over the course of a number of hours, and eventually 5 colectivo members end up dying in that, what eventually ends up being called like the massacre of Quinta Crespo, which is the area of town that this happened. So the justification for why the shootout took place was because the colectivos had killed a national police officer a few weeks before, and no one had paid for this crime, that no one had been arrested. So basically they got away with killing a police officer. So when I talked to Alexis, the national police officer, a few days after the incident, and asked him, what do you think the cause of this shootout was? He told me without hesitation, CCPC officers saw the opportunity to take out a group of criminals who enjoy the protection of the government and took it. So important here is that, as police officers tend to do, Alexis is justifying this violence by appealing to the social function of policing, right? We have to take out criminals. That's our work as police officers. But importantly, what Alexis is doing here is separating the police violence and the action of taking out criminals from government interests. He's actually saying we were fighting against criminals that had the protection of the government. So they very much so see themselves as utilizing violence against the state's interests in its own political project, right? They see themselves as employing violence, not at the state's behest, but instead to be able to actually do the work that they're charged with doing, right? A few weeks after this shootout, there are some massive marches by colectivo members in downtown Caracas. So the translation here is basically like who orders who around. There are colectivo protests that eventually lead to police officers being arrested. So by the end of October, the government responds to this this massacre with a dramatic shakeup of Venezuela's investigative police. So they arrest 6 CCPC members. They remove the Minister of Justice. And this is all arguably a completely understandable response to extrajudicial killings in the country, right? We're very clearly extrajudicial killings. The problem is that extrajudicial killings by the police in Venezuela are not uncommon by any means, but rarely do they produce this kind of reaction from the government. So within this context, police officers do not see this reaction as, kind of like shoring up the rule of law, but instead the government protecting its preferred kind of security forces, right? So I'm wrapping up in just 2 minutes. So the relationship between colectivos and the government, as I mentioned, evolve over time. Under Chavez, the collectivos are very much so seen as kind of like an external threat to the police. It's a non-state armed group exists outside of the state that is threatening our position and our legitimacy. Under Maduro, they start to be seen as an internal threat. And this is because there's some evidence that colectivo members have infiltrated and have become members of the FICE, the special tactical units that I mentioned quickly before. There's some evidence that the FICE have colectivo members within them. And this ends up producing a number of confrontations between police officers themselves. So it's not just the case that you have confrontations between the police and colectivos, but police as well. Let's see if I can get these videos to work. Yeah. There we go. So these videos are from a confrontation in February 2020, when the CCPC went to arrest a FICE officer. They arrested him, had them in their truck, were taking him to their police station, and were confronted on the highway by FICE officers. You have 2 distinct police forces. FICE officers showing up saying, "You're not going to arrest one of our members." And they actually engage in like an all-out brawl on the highway. This shuts down traffic for a number of hours. It's incredibly public. And this is not the only confrontation that takes place between different police forces in broad daylight. So at the same time that the police are, killing thousands of people. This is the same time period, the same years that police are killing thousands. This is the same time period that Maduro is successfully working to consolidate his authoritarian control over state institutions. Even in this context, fragmentation and internal conflicts are key to understanding the security landscape here. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit and just mention some of the implications of the book, and then I'll turn it over to our discussant. So one, what I argue in the book is that we need more diverse accounts of why police officers engage in violence and repression, and a more granular analysis of this uneven nature of police power. So I draw on a lot of work from Latin America and India. Well, not a lot of work. There's actually very little work on this topic. But really thinking about the provisional nature of police power and how officers respond to this unevenness. So in some ways, kind of thinking about, Calevas's work on civil war, where he writes about thinking about violence as a dynamic process, where we need investigations into the sequence of decisions and events that intersect to produce violence. And I think this is something that we very much so need to understand why police are actually engaging in violence in certain contexts. 2, failures of police reform in the region can't be explained without taking into account violent pluralism. In other words, the police are one of many armed groups vying for state resources and protection in certain territories. We see similar outcomes of security policies in the region, but need a better understanding of diverse local mechanisms driving them. And so what I mean by this is that a lot of the scholarship on the way that violence has changed and evolved and morphed in Latin America over the past 20 years has really focused on a shift from authoritarianism to democracy. So the ways that moving away from authoritarianism to democracy result in the pluralization of violence, and how neoliberalism results in outsourcing of security. In the case of Venezuela, we had a left-wing political project that was very much moving away from neoliberalism that produced these outcomes. And we also had a shift from democracy towards authoritarianism that also resulted in a pluralization of armed actors. So this is actually what I'm working on at the Kellogg Center now, is trying to think about a new way to understand authoritarian power operating rather than kind of like centralized state security forces, the ways in which kind of dispersed coercion across multiple state and non-state armed actors are crucial to authoritarian survival in the region. So thank you so much. I think I talked maybe a little bit too long, but I appreciate you listening. You want?
There's some. Should be good.
I'll turn.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for the invitation and for inviting me to respond to your book. I had the pleasure of reading the book beforehand, so I'll share some comments based on my reading, but also in particular of in relation to the two chapters that you presented to us, or the ideas that were in them. So I just want to start by saying off that I read the book as a scholar of Nicaragua, a context that gets frequently compared with Venezuela, where there was also a left-wing revolutionary project that came to power by way of elections and has taken on an increasingly authoritarian form, where there has also been an important presence of non-state armed groups associated in different ways with the government that exercise important security functions. So I was reading it very much with that comparison in mind. Your book really brilliantly demonstrates how this dispersal of coercive power that we might associate with, as you said, with processes including democratization and neoliberalization, here were the result of something else. And as you just said, you narrate how this process started out of the concerns that Chavismo had with the loyalties of the security forces, but also they responded by purchasing arms, right, and allowing the existence of the colectivos, but also this idea that people should be able to defend the revolution themselves, right, affording them different forms of impunity. You also show, contrary to so many narratives of collaboration between police and colectivos, that this new legitimacy of armed colectivos was not necessarily accepted by the police, at least not by the rank and file. And you described in chapter 4, as you showed a little bit of, how from the perspective of the officers, they found themselves humiliated by these tactics of impunity. And so I was hoping to engage you further in saying more about kind of the effectiveness of dispersal as a form of governance. And so I'm going to say a few things about what I was thinking, and hopefully you can respond to that. But so on the one hand, there seems to be this story that you're telling where the Chavista state never really was able to centralize this capacity for force, right? And it depended on the colectivos at a time when it needed to, which was at the moment of the coup. And then, as I understood it, the police reforms undertaken by Chavez, we could think of them as an effort to refound the police in the image of revolution, and even as an effort to kind of re-centralize or reincorporate the police into the project of revolution. That was unsuccessful because of the old guard and the military still being important influences. But a question that arose to me was why the state was not successful in an effort to kind of reincorporate the police after this period when Maduro enters the picture, and it seems like there's a renewal of lethal force or a renewal of these the FIES and I forgot the name of the other kind of security project, where they're giving the police what they want, yeah, in a sense. And so is the argument here that it was like kind of too late at that point, that they had already dispersed coercion to a point where you couldn't bring it back? Or are there other reasons why dispersion is kind of effective? I was thinking, so in relation to Nicaragua, where Nicaragua is a place where the police has a different history of relationship to the government, because it was the police force was formed during the revolution in the 1980s, and so it retains a kind of, it's already sort of incorporated, if we could call it that. But nevertheless, it created these, or it allowed the proliferation of these kind of non-police forces, in part because they could do things that the police in theory couldn't do, right? So they could confront demonstrations in a way that the police in theory couldn't. But also because it allowed the government to make an argument about the people themselves being the ones that are defending the project and not just the state defending itself for them. So they were able to claim that it was, opposition groups and government supporters that were in confrontation and not the state directly repressing an opposition. And so that might be a reason why, or a place where dispersal is effective in governing in the revolutionary context. But so are there other reasons why it might be effective? In the Nicaraguan case as well, the government allowed these forces to exist, but they once they had been kind of deployed in the kind of the moment of crisis, then they found ways to kind of try to bring them back. So they did something similar, which was to make some of those groups, they gave them kind of like police IDs. Mm-hmm. So they kind of reincorporated them into the police force as a means of like kind of bringing back the thing. So there was like a more of an oscillation happening. And I'm wondering from your perspective, how is this functioning in that case? But also, I guess more broadly, what keeps the proliferation of these armed groups, what keeps it functioning from the perspective of the Maduro government? What I mean is, why, if they're not incorporated, then what prevents them from doing what I guess is the theory of autocratic regimes, which is that it's dangerous to have an armed group that you don't control because it can very much turn against you. So, what allows for that not to happen in this context? A third thing that I was thinking in relation to this dispersal of like, again, why it might be effective is because of the ways that sometimes the duplication of forces allows them to kind of police each other rather than like fight up to go upward. So I was thinking of Hannah Arendt's book on totalitarianism and the description of the proliferation of security forces in totalitarian regimes that are doubled so that they're like watching each other. So these are just kind of ideas that sparked my imagination about how dispersal is happening, or like what effects it can have that are productive for governance. Let me see. I have another thing I want to ask about impunity, but I think I'll leave it at that, and then if we have time, maybe I'll ask it or something.
Go back up. You can respond, and then also start taking Q&A.
Great. Okay, thank you so much for those questions. They're like so fantastic. So I'm like there's like so many ways I could come at this, and I think so much of this is so intertwined. So I really appreciate the close reading of the chapters. I think in terms of, I think kind of the questions kind of got at first, like, can the state just not control this dispersal? So I think that's kind of like the question, like, can the state not control it? And if it can control it, why has it not tried to do that? So, okay. So I'll start off with, can the state control these groups? So, I mean, I've been thinking actually a lot, Dan, you have a piece that you wrote with, I think, Sophia Finner on kind of thinking about like, what is the state that's inherited by these like authoritarian regimes? And I think this is really, really important for understanding fragmentation and dispersal in Venezuela. So the type of state that's being inherited, particularly by Maduro, not even talking about Chavez, but by Maduro, is first, policing in Venezuela is incredibly decentralized. So I didn't get to mention this, but there are over 140 police forces in the country. I mean, it's just incredibly decentralized. So just trying to get a handle. This was something that police reformers really suffered with trying to centralize policing. And that was the goal of the police reform, is to not to get rid of all these other different police forces, but at least to say like, we're going to train everybody together, or everyone's going to follow the same manuals. It was really, really unwieldy to be able to do that because there are so many police forces that are under control of different political forces. But also because, and we talk, the book that I co-authored with two other Venezuelan scholars, we're kind of thinking about, why did crime and violence increase so much at the same time that poverty and inequality decreased? Because we usually kind of tend to think about those relationships going, like following each other. And one of the things that we argue is that there's just been a hyper growth of the Venezuelan state because it's an oil state, right? And so anytime you have like large amounts of money coming into the state, you see this massive expansion, a very superficial expansion of the state, which is what happened with the police reform, very quick growth, but not any kind of like actual penetration of society in the way that we think about it, I think, with traditional authoritarian regimes. So the national police force that was created out of this expanded very, very quickly to such a degree that the government could in no way meaningfully, like ideologically indoctrinate the police forces, right? And so even though the National Police Force is created by the Chavez government, you would think this is a police force they're going to trust. There are factions in the Chavismo that do not trust them at all and describe them as a right-wing project. Like they actually say, one of the reasons why police reform gets stopped for a while is because the Minister of Justice says police reform is a right-wing project, or it's against the socialist project. And still later on, because human rights advocates are leading the police reform, they very much so see human rights advocates as aligned with the right. And so even creating their own police force, there is particular factions within Chavismo that do not trust that police force. So you have lots of fragmentation, lots of actors, some of which the state has control over, some of which not. And then you have a bunch of police officers who are not super happy about the reform anyways, particularly because the reform is trying to literally like control and limit police use of force. At the same time, the government is constructing relationships with non-state armed groups that are not at all limited by this police reform, right? So it's just very, very kind of messy on the ground, even these attempts to kind of try to centralize, even like police power itself fail to a large degree for these reasons. So in terms of, so I think, Maduro very much so inherits a situation that they're not capable, at least initially. So it took a very long time for the Maduro government to actually consolidate. I mean, I debate this with a couple other Venezuelan scholars, but we pretty much think that Maduro doesn't consolidate until 2021. So you're talking about a period of 2013 to 2021 where there's still a whole lot of instability. And I think that the way that the government thought about addressing, I don't think this was a long-term plan. I think it was like, we have to handle social control issues right now. Who are the groups that control certain parts of the city or certain territories? They're not the police. So the colectivos and then the gangs that I mentioned as well. So in one of the chapters, I look at these pacts that the government negotiated with gangs in multiple parts of the country, basically saying like, we'll take the police force out of your neighborhood. There'll be tolerance for certain illicit activities, as long as you keep everything pretty calm in the region or in your territory, right? And so that was successful for a period of time, and I think was particularly because these were neighborhoods that the police just had not been able to get. Even with like the OLP happens, particularly in one neighborhood in Caracas, they have 200 raids that go into this neighborhood in the course of 2 years and are still not able to actually like disband the gangs that control the territory. So I think it was kind of like a throwing hands up kind of moment and saying like, we have to try a different tactic right now because we have too many other like fires to put out. Having said all of that, I do think that because the government has successfully consolidated since 2021, a lot of those pacts have really gone away. So I think now is the time that the Maduro government is actually trying to see how far they can get with this centralization. There's definitely been efforts in the past few years to incorporate and kind of legalize the collectives, I think, in the way that you were talking about. But I think these are still kind of processes that are ongoing. So I think that there is definitely some attempts at this like centralization, kind of bringing everyone to the same tent, but they haven't been successful. And I think what's really interesting about the case is that for a long period of time, the Maduro government survived with all of these different armed groups operating they didn't have control over, and continues to survive as they're still kind of trying to gain control over those groups. I don't know if that got at all of your questions, but it was a bit all over the place. But
So the first one is, do you know what's the public attitude to colectivos and police?
Mhm.
And the second one, where do the members of colectivos and police come from? Are they recruited from the same communities? They like, and what about the police that's recruited all over? So
Yeah. So should I take a couple of questions or just? Okay, I'll just go ahead and do this one because I have a question about your question. So do you mean like what's the public attitude about the colectivo police relationship or?
they're like, do they trust them?
Oh, do they trust them? Okay.
Or whatever public opinion
Yeah.
data are available.
Okay. Yeah, so we did some surveys basically asking people who their most trusted security force was. We didn't include colectivos on that survey, which I hate that we did it now. But the police were like always the lowest ranked in terms of trust. So people much preferred the military or the National Guard, which I think is, not surprising for anybody here who works in countries in Latin America or Asia, probably. So yeah, the police are not trusted. So earlier today, I was doing this Q&A on another one of the chapters I have. The title is Malandros Uniformados, which means like a criminal in uniform. And it's a term that's used for the police in Venezuela because there's such a wide recognition that police engage in crime. There was like the survey that came out a number of years ago that like 88% of people who responded to the survey said that police officers are actively engaged in crime. So the police are just, not very well trusted at all. And then, so we do have the project I'm working on now. We've been doing field work in colectivo neighborhoods. And there's very much so like a very clear like split. There are people who feel like much better the colectivos than the police. Like we would rather we have to choose between two different armed groups. The colectivos are much more respondent, or they respond much quicker. They're actually here. They know the neighborhood. And also because the colectivos have become really important in providing services in the neighborhoods that they work in. And so this is going kind of back to this idea of criminal governance. And this is particularly true with food. So for those of you familiar with Venezuela, they've been going through an incredibly devastating economic crisis, and that really hit the food sector. And so the colectivos have been really a part of kind of like funneling food from the state or from local vendors to people. So people benefit from those services. And I think some people are, at least the people we've talked to, some people are okay with that. They're like, well, my dad has healthcare because they like clean up a local health center or something like that. And then other people just feel like it's a very arbitrary, and they become increasingly, I guess, like aggressive in their forms of engaging in social control. So I think there's a very clear split of some people who just feel like this is better than the state. And then other people who just feel like this is like living under like an authoritarian kind of like arbitrary regime. So that's, but still, I would say, I think in general, most people would, if they have to choose an armed force that's going to be like in their neighborhood, they prefer the colectivos over the police, at least those who live in colectivo neighborhoods. And yes, this is a great question. So another chapter in the book, the reason why I use the term malandros uniformados is not because of the way it's traditionally used, which is to highlight the police's participation in crime, but instead to highlight the fact that police officers come from the same neighborhoods that gang members do. I mean, so young men in these neighborhoods have basically kind of two options for stable employment. If you don't want to go into the informal sector, you can either join a gang or a colectivo, or you can join the police. So basically, you're just choosing between two different types of armed groups, which then, of course, like leads to this very efficient system of social control for the state, because you have an innumerable number, countless number of young men who are marginalized in situations where they really only have two options: to join two different armed groups that then have an ideology that they're at conflict with each other and consistently engaging in armed conflict against each other, right? So it's an incredibly efficient form of racialized social control in the city. So these are people who are coming from the exact same neighborhoods. They look very much so like in the chapter on the colectivo, it's really, really difficult to write about these groups because they're clandestine, and the relationships between, less so now, but for a long period of time, the relationships between the colectivos and the government were incredibly clandestine. And so in the chapter where I write about the colectivos, I note that like a lot of this stuff are police officers' narratives about what's going on. That doesn't mean they don't indicate an actual shift, but the actual details of the stories, we don't necessarily have to believe to understand that they're important. So where was I going with that? Oh yeah. So there are lots of rumors that swirl around colectivo members being present at protests, which actually has become more common in recent years, but wasn't that common when the rumors first started. But the problem with this rumor is that it's almost impossible to tell the difference between a colectivo member and a police officer who's not in uniform because they come from the same backgrounds. A lot of police officers, when they retire, become colectivo members. One of the main colectivo members who got killed in Quinta Crespo was a former Metropolitan Police officer. There's so much interesting overlap between these groups. And it's really difficult to be able to distinguish between the two if the police officers are not in uniform. So I think it was oftentimes the case of these early protests, there was assumed that collective members were protesting the protests. It was just police officers not in uniform that people attributed them to being collectivo members. Have that answered your question? Okay. Yeah.
Just wondering why there's not a more of a structuralist overlay on all of this analysis, because I mean, it just seems to me, not being an academic, but, taking interest in current affairs, it seems to me like, first of all, Venezuela is a failed state, right? And maybe that's a thing that everybody understands, so we don't even need to say it. But as a failed state, the rule of law is broken down. So the correct order in governance is that there's rule of law and then the police enforce that rule of law. So if the police are going and killing people in villages, it's extrajudicial. It's not driven by the law. And, so then the question becomes, well, who are the police representing if they're not representing the law? And at the same time, you have a leftist government, like an extreme leftist government, and you have leftist gangs of the colectivos that are armed, and they're also not operating according to any law. So in this failed state, the breakdown becomes futile, where there's groups of different gangs under different leadership. And even the police, you said that there's 140 different police groups. If they're not bound together by law, structurally, from a structural perspective, it kind of demands a different level of analysis. I mean, I shouldn't say different, but it demands a level of analysis where you look at and you see, well, okay, so what's happening structurally here? So the police are oriented with the right, typically, right? And the imperialist project and, hauling wealth out of Latin America for North America, let's say. And there's all the oil money and corruption, right? So these are structural, political, economic factors. And why are those not used as kind of a base point to do the sociological analysis?
Well, I think, so I think there are a couple of different topics there. One, I don't necessarily I don't like the term failed state because I think it's very, the debate is kind of like, well, what does a failed state look like? The Chavista state was very, very successful in a lot of, particularly when Chavez was in office, people had access to healthcare and food in a way they never had access to healthcare and food before because of state programs and policies. So I don't think it's about Venezuela being a failed state. It's about what is the state deciding to put its resources into, and then what are the outcomes of that? And the question of are these police initiatives failed? I don't think so. I think they were very successful at doing what the government wanted them to do. But that's not failure. That's an incredibly successful government policy that's being implemented.
Law.
Well, so that's actually debatable because there's an executive order that legalizes these initiatives. So they aren't technically, I would agree with you subjectively, but they aren't technically extrajudicial killings if they are, there's an executive order allowing them to engage in certain practice. And it was the Minister of Justice that actually, I talk about this in one of the chapters, provides what they call a green light to kill. So it's not that this is something that's happening bottom up. It's very much so happening from the top. No, it's from the top down. It's the Minister of Justice who's telling the police.
So let's look at the next.
Yeah.
I think you had.
I appreciate that.
But I do just want to end really quickly by saying the rule of law has, never really existed in the way that we think that it does in most places. It's not like the police were enforcing the rule of law before Chavismo. So this is not just a problem like Chavismo. This is just a longer standing problem in Latin America with the police. Yeah.
Well, sort of follow up on that. We had Chavez embark on the nationalization campaign, which affected the credit rating, which led to the hyperinflation, which led to the famine in the what I see in the newspapers, they talk about the famine in the what was it, 2022?
No, so just really quickly on that, the inflation had nothing to do, well, very little to do with the humanitarian crisis that started in the country. It's because oil prices dropped so much. If oil prices had remained as high as they did, then Venezuela would have not fallen into the humanitarian economic crisis. So, I mean, we know from research that what drove the economic crisis was first massive drops in oil that happened in 2014, 2015, and then US sanctions that were placed on top of those in 2019. And that's what's exacerbated the economic. So the inflation, it makes things worse, but inflation was bad in Venezuela, when Chavez was in office and everyone was doing very well economically.
Right, but
or many people were.
There was a campaign of nationalization, which of course leads to ostracization from global financial markets.
Oh, well, no, the oil industry in Venezuela was nationalized long before Chavez. Chavez didn't nationalize the oil; it was nationalized long before him.
When we have lack of what traditionally is called rule of law, what Hannah Arnett would call rule of law, and not simply just the rule of dictate, but the systems for control of it. You described what to me sounded like warlordism and banditry among the police, and in a system where the right in your example, because that was banditry, right? That was banditry in that they were stealing things and killing someone, and then the police exercising control over their fiefdom, saying.
Oh, no, the police didn't have, I think the police wish they had that amount of control over the territories. These were very targeted raids that would happen. The police would go in and would steal from people in some cases and would kill, and completely authorized by the government to do this. This is not something, and then would leave. And they were not engaging in governance by any means, which is why you have these other groups who are actually engaging in governance in these spaces.
But isn't that banditry?
No, banditry is usually people engaging in some kind of crime, in some kinds of crimes to be able to kind of then redistribute wealth among a population, either to gain their loyalty or for political purposes. And the police are not in any way engaged. That's my entire argument. The police are not engaged in a political project here, or if they are, they're resisting a political project.
I was thinking the same. I didn't communicate with my friend here about it, but I was thinking about the same thing. About from the structural standpoint, we had hyperinflation. We had a situation where there was famine. We had a situation without rule of law. So, of course, the police are not that we would see a great deal of this sort of whoever is supposed to.
This is some of the work that we try to do as qualitative researchers and ethnographers. You can't necessarily assume, and this is very much what I'm trying to do with the police actions. From the outside, you can tell a very clean, neat story about why the police do what they do, or why police violence goes up when the economy is in shambles or something like that, right? And my entire point is that those very clean narratives that we think we understand from the outside look very different on the ground. We can't just understand. So, for example, the police violence that's happening during this time period, for them has nothing to do with even with dealing with social unrest during an economic crisis by any means. It actually has a lot to do with them feeling like they have given the liberty by the government to combat gangs that the government in the past has sponsored. And so it's a very different story for them about what they're doing. And I think it matters a whole lot to actually understand why police officers think they're engaging in the violence they're engaging in. And it's also not necessarily the case. There have been massive economic swings in Venezuela, and we haven't seen this type of police violence. This is astronomical. There's nothing. So, I don't think you can cleanly relate, there's an economic crisis, so that's why we see police violence go up, right? There's a lot more factors that are important to understand than just the economy imploding.
I wasn't looking at
let's move on. Let's move so sorry. Yeah, that's okay. That's fine. Let's just move to the next question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question. So I really liked your argument when you laid out, like, I think this is really new thinking about how police violence is not part of the state project, right? Or is not sort of directly trying to enact that on the ground. And so I'm curious, just because you said it's so decentralized in Venezuela, and there are different militarized and armed groups. What I guess I'm wondering, like, what is the conscious political project they are participating in? Is there a nuanced ideology there, or is it more of a ad hoc reacting to fires that come up and sort of firefighting on this? Yeah, like is there an ideology
For the police, you mean?
Yeah. Or not an ideology?
Yeah.
Like what is
there?
Is it explicitly like, oh, we're not participating in the state project, or it just happens to be that?
I mean, I don't think that I think that there's a mentality of survival, and we are trying to do our jobs the best that we can within this particular like set of circumstances. So I think the police very much so, as I mentioned before, like still utilize all of the narratives that we hear from police everywhere else about what their function is. They just see themselves going about it in a very different way and having to work under kind of different limitations. So there's not really, I mean, there's not a clear political project beyond we're here to fight crime, to fight criminals, to take out criminals. That's very much the language that's used. We just have to do it in different ways. So, I mean, this is not political. It's just kind of going, I think, to the more kind of emotional component of this. But so the pacts that I was talking about before, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but there were pacts between the gangs and government that took place first between 2013 and 2015. Then those were broken with the raids that I was talking about before in 2015 and started again in 2017. And most of them broke again in 2021. When you talk to police officers about that period of 2015, they talk about like the rabia. I mean, they use this term, like we had so much hatred for the gangs that had been flaunting police power, that we were thrilled, with the like massive expansion, like our ability to actually go in and wipe out these gangs. I mean, there's just such a, so I'd say like less than ideological and more a very kind of like visceral response that police officers have to a lot of these policies. I mean, yeah, it's just kind of hard to over exaggerate kind of like how offensive the police find these relationships between the government, the colectivos, and the government and the gangs. And so I think a lot of this is more so driven by feelings of being very, what's the word? Traicionado. Yeah, thank you. Very betrayed, and really like left out to dry. So I really think that they feel like they're in kind of like a position of survival, which I think is really interesting. I mean, it's a question that like I think about all of the time is the police has been effectively politically repressing, but if it's not for an ideological project, then, why are they doing that? I have other like theories as to why that's the case, but I have absolutely no evidence to show that it's ideologically motivated.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. This has been a really interesting talk. I wonder actually if it's okay if I ask you a bit about kind of the process.
Yeah.
So, I imagine that it took a lot of relationship building. It took a lot of kind of trying to figure out how to navigate what is, in general, kind of a challenging context for ethnography, but adding into it the fact that you're actually studying something that the people you're talking with might feel, concerned about how you then kind of receive think about what they're saying and doing. And there's just kind of this really challenging political context. I wonder if you could just maybe share with us a little bit about how did you navigate that? How did you, I guess, kind of, I'm maybe like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I taught, I don't think it's a lengthy methods chapter, but I do have a pretty large methods chapter talking about this. One of the reasons why I think it's really important to talk about, because the parts of the book that come from these, I think, more sensitive topics is data that I collected much later in my career and in my project. And I think that's important because more recently I feel like I talk to students who kind of come up with these very like risky projects without having any kind of like contact or like context for what they're working on, because it sounds like an interesting project. And I really worry about that because there's no way I would have done a lot of this field research if I hadn't started on like police reform. Those being like human rights activists and was largely focused on like community policing. So I had like a number of years working on that aspect and some of like the politicization stuff before getting into some of the more delicate aspects. I mean, there's a lot to talk about with methods here. I mean, one of the things I always like to highlight, and I talk about this a lot in my methods chapter, is I dealt with a lot of sexual harassment when I was doing this research, which I think is really important to just kind of talk about in general, because we don't talk about sexual harassment of researchers when they're doing field work. And that really shaped a lot of my project. And I think it does for a lot of women and a lot of queer researchers. And so I actually have an entire book on that topic that I wrote as I was getting through trying to get through my dissertation. I ended up actually working with police off the clock to a large degree because the government didn't want really any researchers, but much less like a gringo researcher coming in to do research on the police. But I think that was really, really useful because one, I think we already have a lot of ethnographies of the police on the job. And I think a lot of that work comes from men, which is great, which is fine. But I think, there's a particular type of like masculine bravado that happens when men are talking to each other, particularly like police officers talking to men. And so I think I was able to get access to some more kind of intimate, personal, and these like ideas of like vulnerability that became very clear in my research, I think became really, really important because I initially wanted to do like on the job research, but wasn't able to because of because I couldn't get permission to do it. So I guess like the takeaway from all that is just like, I mean, it just took I spent a lot of time working with people and gaining access and building connections, not just to keep myself safe, but I mean, particularly because probably even if you haven't been to Latin America, you don't like, it's not surprising that I do not fit in there at all when I'm doing research. So you also have to be very careful about like me putting other people at risk when I'm like going out to do these things. But unfortunately, I think like my answer or response to these questions is like time, which is not something people have in PhD programs, unfortunately. So,
I was really, just struck in the talk about just this relationship between revolution and state coercion. Because like one of the first things we're taught, Scotch Bowl, revolutions are supposed to lead to some kind of, consolidation of state authority, stronger state, particularly the coercive apparatus, and that's kind of what we expect. And I kept sort of throughout the talk and thinking like nothing about this looks like consolidation. Yeah. Toward the end, you use the word consolidation, but then it was like, so what is this if not sort of consolidated? And I was thinking about a couple different possibilities, a couple different examples, and it's going to lead to a question about the military. Okay. So one possibility is this is just sort of it's an ongoing revolution. So like one of Scotch Bowl's cases was China, which the revolution is 1911. Then you got, about 4 decades of, warlordism. And then eventually you get a revolution, like Zizek says, right? Revolution strikes twice, right? So then 49, so we're in this warlordism period, which could be part of what will historically look like some kind of revolution. So that's one possibility, something ongoing, which would imply something I think about ideology, which maybe isn't there, but that was one possibility. Another possibility is that, so I think people are using dispersed and decentralized interchangeably. I think they're really different things. Yeah. So one possibility is this is dispersed because of a lack of control, and another possibility is no, this is sort of decentralized by design, and where your allies are decentralized. And there, the analogy for me is like Indonesia, 1949. So very, very successful revolution, nationalist revolution, but it had these different territorial commands, which still exist to this day. So it's not dispersed in some random way. It's like, no, that's just where the revolution was. So that's so it could be ongoing, it could be decentralized. And a third possibility is it's just unsuccessful, right? This is something that had revolutionary intent or pretext or however you want to put it, but just didn't happen. And what got me thinking about was the contrast or the comparison with Turkey. So Turkey, 2016, you have this coup against Erdogan, right? And the response is not some kind of dispersal and decentralization, but Erdogan just basically seizes the military, you know, and makes it his own. I mean, this is talk about a legacy institution deeply hostile to Erdogan's project, and this is his chance just to strike and totally remake the state in a way that serves his interests, right? And that just got me thinking about it. It was amazing to me, this whole talk. Like, it's all about the coercive power of the state, but you didn't mention the military. Because in my mind, the way I've imagined this is, well, he doesn't have much else, but he's got the military. And my sense is that that's where, at the end of the day, how do you survive hyperinflation? How do you survive all of these things? It's probably with the military. So I just wonder, what do you think of these different visions of what the relation between this current moment is and revolution? And then what about, how does the military fit in? Because like, to me, like a place like Thailand, the police and the military, like there's all of these kinds of fights. That's a very common thing. There's the police and the military, right? So what happens with the military?
Yeah. So I mean, I very much do think about this as, so like, as I said before, I don't consider Chavez an authoritarian leader. I think he was running a hybrid democratic project. So authoritarianism for me doesn't really begin until Maduro comes into office in 2013. And he doesn't really get started, I think, until 2014. And I think, I mean, I guess like ongoing revolution makes sense. There's a term that I can't remember. What is it? It's like not spontaneous, but basically, I mean, I think this is a case of a revolution that when Maduro comes into power is incredibly unstable. I mean, he won his first election, which elections did matter. He won his first election with less than 2% of the popular vote. And the military is an interesting issue here because he didn't have support in the military for a long period of time. So Chavez did because he came from the military. He had a lot of backing from the military. He remade the military to make them very politicized. And I aligned with the Chavista project. When Maduro wins, there's a lot of concern about whether or not the military is going to back him. And it takes him years to get the military on board with him being the president. So I think that has a lot to do. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to mention that as well. It's not just that there are tense relationships between the government and the police, but Maduro very much so, I did not feel like he could depend on the military for a long period of time. Also because Diosdado Cabello, who's another very important figure in Venezuela, is the one who had a lot of control within the military. So there's always a concern of him leading a coup against Maduro. So there were very like tenuous relationships between Maduro and the military for a long period of time. So I mean, this isn't going to sound very academic, but I very much so just kind of think about Maduro during his first few years trying to put out so many fires. I mean, he comes into office, the economy has been weakened in that it's even more dependent on oil than it was before. Then oil prices dropped dramatically. Massive protests characterize his first few years in office. Crime is still going up. The political opposition is getting better organized. So there's just so many, the military doesn't support him. I think there are so many fires to be put out that I'm not even sure that there was a conversation about consolidation at that point, which I think is why it took so long for them actually to get to the point they're at now, where there is actually a consolidation over state institutions. So I guess that would be ongoing revolution. And I have looked a little bit at the Chinese case to kind of try to understand this. I think it's been a lot more chaotic for so much longer than it seems like, but maybe not. But just a lot of like in the moment planning. I think that was even true of the most recent elections. This is getting too into like Venezuelan history, so I apologize. But in most recent elections, they were like blatantly stolen by the Maduro government. But it took them a couple of hours to come out and steal the election. And I very much so believe, and other Venezuelan colleagues believe, that's because they really thought they were going to win the elections and had no plan about what to do if they didn't. And so like literally those hours, they were like, shit, what are we going to do? And how are we going to convince people that we actually won this election? So I do still think there's still like just a lot of catch up that's going on. Which I think has a lot to do with the degree of state fragmentation. So this is the argument that we put forward in the Paradox book is the Chavista project has resulted in so much state fragmentation. So it is an issue, I think, of both dispersal and decentralization. And I agree, I think those are two different mechanisms, but I think they're both happening. And I think that the Maduro government is just now trying to get a handle on some of that state fragmentation. I don't know if that answered any of
Yes, there's, the elephant in the room that I don't think we have addressed, and that is the exit route.
Mhm.
All of the people, I mean, the continuous revolution requires that, and in the case of China, control the population exit.
Mhm.
But in the case of Venezuela, particularly if we look at the different waves of Venezuelans to the region, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Argentina, and then now United States, you see waves of Venezuelans first exiting with their capital in 2013 to Colombia, many of whom were dual citizens. And then we see the professionals, so all of this quote unquote manpower or power.
Yeah.
And professionals in the services, that move, you know, as nurses, doctors moving to other countries that welcome them, like Argentina, even Chile. So I guess that's something to consider within the equation is what is the relationship between the you know the population or these places where the police officers come from, and but precisely who's left behind after all of these massive exits and these waves. I've counted 3 waves. The first one with Capital in 2013, 2014, right about the time when Maduro left. And then we have the professionals in 2016, 2017, many of them engineers on oil, petroleum that had no jobs. And now this working class, poor Venezuelans moving across borders, not only southbound, but also northbound through the Darien Gap, and through those Central America, Mexico to the United States.
Yeah.
So I guess that's something also to consider. What is the relationship between those who are left behind, which are pretty much those who cannot go to country, who are protecting them in terms of who are from the I forgot the word, the colectivos and las megabandas, and who is left. I mean, many of them might be members of the same household and that protect the entire community. So I think that's something.
Yeah. I mean, I just one thing I would note about that. There is a lot of discourse around the colectivos engaging in political repression outside of the neighborhoods where they operate. And that's oftentimes used, I get contacted a lot for Venezuelan asylum cases. And that's oftentimes one of the justifications that's used for needing political asylum. There's not really any good data to suggest that the colectivos are operating or governing outside of their neighborhoods. I mean, they do go to protests to engage in political repression, but it's not like, I mean, I don't think it's Nicaragua, I think is a more so a case of these groups that are kind of like being deployed outside of their territory to engage in actions. The collectivos, I think, it's a very misunderstood aspect. The collectivos are very neighborhood based and will leave every once in a while during protests. But I think, in terms of the exile, I think there are 2 different things happening there. One, I very much think that the Maduro government is like, fine. I think that's one of the reasons why they thought that they were going to win the election this year, is because they felt like, most of the people who were going to vote against them had left, and there was no real mechanism for exiles to vote in the election. But then I also think that this is happening increasingly. So Andres Glazer, who's in the sociology department at Chicago, has this really fantastic book looking at the ways that socialist ideology, kind of creates this echo chamber to such a degree that there's really no way for like the upper echelon to actually be connected to reality. And I think that's very much happening within some circles of like Maduro. Because of this consolidation, they've had to expel so many people from this very, very tight circle. And I really believe that there is a belief within that circle that not that many Venezuelans have left. I mean, I really think that there is at least a rejection that it's that many Venezuelans. I think there's probably some like socialist like echo chamber stuff going on. Like, we've had some people leave, but complete like separation from reality about the numbers that have left. And that's at least like the official rhetoric the government gives, is all of these numbers are being, calculated by like imperialists and whatever.
No, last one, go for it.
Well, no, because last one, this one I'll shoot. I had a question about language, about you said colectivos.
The colectivos,
Is this, I understand, I get an idea of what it means from the word, but is this any way related to the idea of the the collective farm, the collective unit that you have in Soviet Union.
Mhm.
It's the same concept, only what you're describing, collectivos
Mhm.
are a armed group,
Mhm.
and they're not actually fulfilling any of the functions that we think of as a Soviet or a Chinese collective
Mhm.
unit. Is that fair to say?
So the term colectivo is really interesting. And when I talk about this, I try to say like, this is a new term that's applied to them. That's not a term that the collectivos applied to themselves. So their collectives are very much so aligned with the vision of Chavismo as being like this very like communal project. So like ideologically, yes, but the term colectivo actually is from the police and journalists. They're the ones who started to use, so before really kind of like 2014, the collectives were just referred to as like work groups, like grupos de trabajo, or they were referred to by their actual names. And really 2014 onwards, police officers and journalists really popularized the use of the term colectivo to kind of refer to them in general. And
Idiomatic. It's idiomatic.
yeah, so it just got picked up particularly because there was a lot of conversation about the colectivos engaging in repression at protests at that time period. It kind of just got picked up and now is utilized among like all of it. Like if you ask any Venezuelan what a colectivo is, they will know exactly what you're talking about. But it's a very, very new term that was kind of like placed onto them by the police and by journalists. It wasn't, it's not something they kind of like adopted themselves as like a representation of their connection to like larger socialist struggles or anything. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is our last event of the year, so I want to give a big thanks to Zaire and Rosa in particular for all the work that they've done throughout the year to put these events on board. A little reception outside to celebrate all we've done this year, so please feel free to join us. But I want to thank Luciana Chamorro and Rebecca Hanson, first of all, for coming out and giving us this Facebook talk.
No, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Great.